Imagine walking through Tokyo and hearing Dutch spoken on every street corner, seeing windmills next to Buddhist temples, and eating sushi with Dutch cheese. What if the Dutch East India Company had successfully colonized Japan in the 17th century? What if the samurai fell to Dutch muskets and Japan became another jewel in the Netherlands trading empire? Would Japanese culture have been erased, or would a unique Dutch-Japanese fusion have emerged? Would Japan have industrialized even earlier, or remained trapped as a colonial possession? In our timeline, the Dutch were the only Europeans allowed to trade with Japan during the Sakoku period. From 1641 to 1853, the Dutch East India Company maintained a tiny trading post on the artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki harbor. They were prisoners on their own island, allowed only limited contact with Japanese merchants. The Dutch brought Western knowledge, books on medicine, astronomy, military technology, and science. This Dutch learning, or rangaku, became Japan's window to the Western world, but the Dutch never had the military power to conquer Japan. The Tokugawa shogunate was too strong, too unified, and too isolationist to fall to foreign invasion. However, what if circumstances had been different? What if Japan had been weaker, and the Dutch much stronger and more ambitious? Imagine that in the 1630s, Japan faces catastrophic internal crisis. Perhaps a succession crisis tears the Tokugawa shogunate apart, with rival daimyo warlords plunging the country back into civil war, or maybe a massive earthquake and tsunami devastate central Japan, killing millions and destroying Edo. At the same time, the Dutch East India Company is at the height of its power, wealthier and more militarily capable than in our timeline. They've just conquered more of Indonesia and are looking for new opportunities in Asia. Dutch merchants in Nagasaki witness Japan's weakness and send urgent reports back to Batavia. The VOC governors see an unprecedented opportunity. A vulnerable Japan could become their greatest conquest. In 1638, a massive Dutch fleet arrives with 10,000 soldiers, advanced cannons, and a plan to exploit Japan's internal divisions. The Dutch invasion would exploit Japan's fragmentation rather than attacking directly. The Dutch would use their classic colonial strategy, divide and conquer. They'd ally with rebel daimyo against the weakened shogunate, providing superior firearms and military advisors. Dutch muskets and cannons would prove devastating against samurai warriors. Despite their legendary skill and honor, samurai armor and swords couldn't withstand European artillery and disciplined musket volleys. Major battles would be brutal but decisive. Imagine the siege of Osaka Castle, where Dutch cannons pound the supposedly impregnable fortress into submission, or the Battle of Sekigahara II, where Dutch-backed forces destroy the shogunate's last army. By 1645, the Dutch East India Company controls Japan's major ports and cities. The last shogun commits seppuku rather than surrender. Japan becomes a Dutch colonial possession. The Dutch would establish a colonial government, unlike any Japan had known. The VOC would install a governor-general in Edo, which they'd rename New Amsterdam van het Oosten, New Amsterdam of the East. A small Dutch elite would rule over millions of Japanese subjects. Unlike the Spanish or Portuguese, the Dutch were pragmatic traders, not religious zealots. They wouldn't force Christianity on Japan aggressively, instead focusing on economic exploitation. The samurai class would be systematically dismantled. Some would be integrated into colonial military units, but most would lose their privileges and lands. The rigid Tokugawa social hierarchy would collapse. Japanese daimyo who cooperated would be allowed to keep limited power as puppet rulers, similar to Dutch-controlled Javanese sultans. Those who resisted would be executed or exiled. The Dutch would transform Japan's economy to serve European markets. Japan's silver mines, especially in Iwami, would be expanded massively using forced labor. These mines would rival Potosi in South America, flooding European markets with Japanese silver. Rice production would be intensified to feed other Dutch colonies and for export to China. The Dutch would control all trade, imposing monopolies on key goods like silk, copper, and lacquerware. Traditional Japanese crafts would be redirected toward European tastes. Samurai swordmakers would be forced to produce trade goods. Porcelain factories would manufacture Dutch-designed pieces. The VOC would establish massive plantations for cash crops. Tea, tobacco, and eventually indigo and sugar would be grown on former samurai estates using Japanese peasant labor. The profits would be staggering, making Japan one of the richest Dutch colonial possessions. Despite colonial oppression, a unique hybrid culture would emerge. The Dutch language would become mandatory for government and commerce. Japanese would be relegated to a peasant language, creating a linguistic hierarchy. An educated Dutch-speaking Japanese elite would emerge. Christianity would spread more successfully under Dutch rule, but in syncretistic forms. Imagine Buddhist temples converted to Dutch Reformed churches, with Japanese architectural elements preserved. Dutch education would be imposed on Japanese children. Schools would teach Dutch history, geography, and values, while Japanese history would be presented as backward and barbaric. But cultural exchange would work both ways. Dutch colonists would adopt Japanese foods, architectural styles, and aesthetics. A Creole culture would develop in port cities, blending European and Japanese elements. Japanese art would influence Dutch tastes. Imagine if Dutch Golden Age painting had incorporated Japanese techniques 200 years earlier than in our timeline. The Japanese would never accept foreign domination quietly. Samurai would wage guerrilla warfare from the mountains, refusing to surrender their honor. Ninja clans would assassinate Dutch officials. Buddhist monasteries would become centers of resistance. Major rebellions would erupt periodically, perhaps a Shimabara-style Christian rebellion, or a massive peasant uprising against Dutch taxation and forced labor. Secret societies preserving Japanese culture would operate underground. They'd teach traditional martial arts, preserve Japanese literature, and plot eventual liberation. The Dutch would respond with brutal repression. Villages suspected of harboring rebels would be burned. Public executions would be common. Japanese culture would be actively suppressed. This cycle of resistance and repression would define Dutch-Japanese relations for generations. Ironically, Dutch colonization might bring earlier modernization. The Dutch would introduce European technology to exploit resources more efficiently. Steam engines for mines, mechanized looms for textiles, and modern shipbuilding techniques would arrive decades earlier. Japanese workers would learn European industrial techniques, even as they labored under colonial exploitation. A class of Japanese engineers and technicians would emerge. By the 1850s, as the Dutch grip weakens due to European conflicts, educated Japanese would have the knowledge to industrialize independently. The eventual independence movement would be led not by traditional samurai, but by Western-educated Japanese industrialists and intellectuals who had learned from their colonizers. By the late 19th century, Japan would fight for freedom. Inspired by independence movements in other colonies and weakened by European wars, the Dutch hold on Japan would loosen. Japanese nationalism would explode. A coalition of former samurai descendants, industrial workers, and Western-educated intellectuals would lead the revolution. Using weapons and tactics learned from the Dutch, they'd wage a sophisticated independence war. The struggle would be bloody. Dutch colonists would fight desperately to keep their richest Asian possession. But ultimately, international pressure and Japanese determination would prevail. Imagine Japan gaining independence in 1905, the same year they defeated Russia in our timeline, but instead of defeating a foreign power, they'd be expelling their colonial masters. An independent Japan with 250 years of Dutch colonization would be radically different. The Dutch language would remain influential, similar to English in India. A significant Eurasian Dutch-Japanese population would exist, creating complex racial dynamics. Japan would industrialize rapidly, but with deep resentment toward Europe. Rather than admiring and emulating the West like Meiji Japan, they'd be fiercely anti-colonial. Japanese culture would be a unique blend. Traditional arts would experience a renaissance as symbols of resistance, but Dutch influences would be deeply embedded in language, law, and architecture. Japan might become a leader of anti-colonial movements across Asia, using their experience to help other nations resist European imperialism. The anger from colonization might make Japan even more militaristic and aggressive in the 20th century than in our timeline. So what do you think would have happened if the Dutch had colonized Japan? Would Japanese culture have survived 250 years of colonial rule, or would it have been permanently transformed? Would an industrialized, colonized Japan have been stronger or weaker than the Japan of our timeline? And here's the biggest question. Would the experience of colonization have made Japan more sympathetic to other colonized peoples, or even more determined to become a colonial power itself? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Like this video if you enjoyed exploring this alternate history, and subscribe for more scenarios that reimagine the past. Because sometimes the most fascinating alternate histories are those where the colonizers and colonized switch roles from what actually happened.